Drama over Elevation Church's Easter invites, a foster family's pronoun fight, and a Gold Star family's shocking experience with President Joe Biden. That and more on today's Higher Ground. I'm joined today by CBN News' Goins Phillips and Washington Times reporter Valerie Richardson. We're going to get into these issues and more. As you know, on this show, in this new format, reporters, TV hosts, and others get together to share their thoughts and go behind the headlines into some of today's biggest faith and culture stories. With no further ado, let's dive right in and welcome Trey and Valerie to the show.
So Trey and Val, really excited to have both of you on today. You both have picked really, and I'm laughing because Trey, the story you picked, it's made me laugh a little bit, but also it's made me kind of scratch my head a little. And I think we'll probably start with you. And this story was Stephen Furtick out of Elevation Church, and a little bit of an Easter drama unfolding there. Can you kind of take us through what's happening?
I know. I feel like, Easter always potentially there's drama that happens, especially with bigger churches. There's always something because people, I think, were looking with a big outside lens looking in. And it's easy to get kind of overwhelmed by things. But so Elevation Church, North Carolina megachurch led by obviously Stephen Furtick. They've got 20 locations. They caused a bit of controversy this week. So Nikki Shearer, she's the director of digital content for Elevation. She made this news during a conversation with Pro Church Tools. So according to her, Elevation is not going to be using biblical phrases like resurrection, Calvary, or blood of Jesus in its Easter invitations this year. So why is that the decision being made? So she said the church doesn't want to use those words because they, quote, immediately could make someone feel like an outsider. She's saying they're kind of Christianese words, they're Bible-based terms that people who are unchurched, unfamiliar with the gospel, they might be turned off by those words. She said, when I think about how I'm going to talk about Easter, I'm thinking about how I'm going to talk to people who are far from God. Then she later said, this is really an important guide for how we develop language. She said, anyone can be part of our church. It might not be for everyone. Everyone might not like it, but anyone can come. So it's obviously very much a seeker-friendly approach to Easter, to church in general, which obviously there's a lot of discussion to be had about that, but that seems to be the direction they're coming from. And I want to note before we open it up too, that Pro Church Tools did attempt to clarify Elevation's stance. They wrote on a blog post about this conversation, importantly, Elevation absolutely emphasizes the resurrection of Christ in an Easter service and uses the word resurrection, yet you won't find it on any Easter invitation of theirs. So certainly an interesting conversation that's now going on at Elevation.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, but Val, I'll just I'll throw it to you first on this because I'm going to stop there. I'll let you go, Val, and then I will weigh in.
I think it's really interesting that they made it a point to say that they weren't using resurrection. I think if they had put out their invitations and not said anything, I don't know that anyone would have noticed, But the fact that they're being so deliberate about it, I think is going to offend a lot of people, a lot of Christians, frankly, who are going to say, hey, Easter's all about the resurrection. Why aren't you saying resurrection?
Yeah, well, and also this is the one holiday. I mean, there's Christmas too, but I think more so Easter when people show up. It's funny. I was at a service in Pennsylvania last weekend at a church I've never gone to before. And the pastor was saying, next week, make sure you all, sit really close together because there's going to be 1 million people here for Easter and there won't be seats. And I was thinking, this is a holiday when people show up regardless of what they think because there's a spiritual curiosity because of what Easter is. So it almost struck me as odd that they went so far as to not offend people in the invitation. But I agree with you, Val. Nobody would have even noticed. But here they are giving this whole strategy. It's almost like, hey, we're dangling candy out and you're going to show up and we're going to serve you broccoli. Like that's what it felt like the way that they were framing it, So I don't know. I mean, Trey, I don't know if you want to add anything to it. I just find it to be the entire ordeal was an avoidable crisis for the church, it feels like.
Well, I think so. It's interesting. Not only are they kind of showing their cards when it comes to their internal social media strategy and marketing strategy, but they're also suggesting that attendees of Elevation Church really buy into this strategy. You can go onto the Elevation website and you can literally copy and paste what they're saying you should be texting to your unbelieving friends and family members. They say in this message that you can copy and paste and send out, hey, do you have Easter plans, or do you have plans for Easter Sunday? I'm heading to Easter at Elevation. Would you like to join me? The music and the message are always incredible. It's honestly one of my favorite ways to celebrate the holiday. I'd love to have you as my guest this year. So, again, very clearly, no use of any sort of biblical words surrounding Easter. So it's interesting. I think my biggest gripe with stuff like this is we act as if the gospel needs better marketing. And I just don't think that
Mm.
that's really true. I think the gospel speaks for itself. I think the word of the Lord never returns void. And I think the best way to talk about the gospel is to use the words that Jesus uses in his word. I just don't think we need to sugarcoat or find a better way to present the gospel as if Jesus's way has been insufficient.
Yeah. Well, yeah, to me it's like, and I think from a comms perspective, yeah, it's all candy, none of it's broccoli, right? We know the gospel is amazing and it's going to change people's lives. So, but I felt like the way they framed it was like we kind of have to conceal this so people don't get. It's like no, people are showing up on Easter because they are curious, and
Yeah.
I think it's great to make people feel like they fit in. I just from sort of pulling back from a journalistic communication standpoint, I'm thinking, goodness, you should not have said this on any sort of show. Like I don't know why you
Yeah.
even admitted to it or did it in the first place. But
Well,
Mhm.
yeah, the one thing that I want to add too is I don't know the heart behind it, right? Like I'm not saying that Nikki Shearer was going in and had some sort of nefarious motivation. I don't think Elevation necessarily had this like we want to pull a bait and switch on people. We don't know what led to this public decision. Like what were the private conversations that led to this point? But I do want to highlight one of the critiques was from Shane Idleman. He's a pastor at Westside Christian Fellowship in Southern California. He was very strong in his condemnation. He called the decision wokeism and said the attempt to avoid offending potential visitors to Elevation actually, quote, offended God. He said, when did the church become for non believers? We are to welcome them, reach them, love them, and understand them. But at the end of the day, I'm here because of God, and I will not apologize if that's a little too strong. And the last thing that I kind of want to get both of y'all's thoughts on this, but um, I think that opens up the debate of which is a conversation many Christians have had. I've been a part of these conversations, which is what's the church for? Are our corporate gatherings on Sundays a form of discipleship? Are they a tool of evangelism? Or are they a little bit of some combination of both?
I'll throw to you on that one first, Val.
I think those are really good questions. I think and you make some great points there. Yeah, I thought Billy's point about the fact that you even had the expression CE Christians referring to Christmas Easter Christians. People that only show up on Christmas and Easter. I mean, did you really need any more? Any other strategy to get them there because they're probably going to come anyway. But yeah, it does make you sort of wonder what's the church for? Is it are you counting heads and winning prizes when you get more people in the pews, or are you trusting God to reach people and versus your own marketing campaign?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would second all of that. And Val, I want to transition over to your story because, honestly, there's so many crazy things going on in the world right now, but you have a couple of stories and they sort of dovetail with each other. One of them is about this Christian foster family out in Washington State and these rules over pronouns and this legal battle that is sort of, unfolding now as a result of this. Take us through your story.
Yeah, I'm just going to give you some background in the sense that the state of Washington right now has a foster care crisis. Not long ago, they were putting foster kids in their caseworkers' cars and in their offices on sleeping bags because they didn't have any place to put them. And against this backdrop, we've got Shane and Jennifer DeGrosse, a couple who have been fostering kids for 9 years, applied to renew their license and were rejected because they wouldn't agree to the agency's new rules saying that you had to basically affirm the children's sexual orientation and gender identity and expression by, for example, bringing them to pride parades and certainly by definitely using their chosen pronouns and chosen names. Now, in the case of the DeGrosses, the whole thing was sort of irrelevant or moot because the foster kids they had previously fostered were ranged from like newborns to 3-year-olds. In other words, very young children. But they refused to do that. It probably wouldn't have even been an issue with them, but they said no, we can't do that. We're committed Christians. This is gonna fly in the face of our faith, and they were rejected. And so now they are suing. Alliance Defending Freedom is representing them.
Yeah, I mean, and Trey, I'll get your reaction to this in a second. It is interesting to me the first detail that you shared there, which is that there is a foster care crisis. We know this is a problem around the country. You would almost think that the last thing the government would be doing is creating litmus tests, on this sort of issue. This isn't a life or death issue; it's a perspective issue. When there's such a need, that's the part that stuck out to me as interesting in this particular story, but also the fact that there might even be any sort of religious litmus test, to be able to foster children. I mean, that seems troubling to
Well,
me, Trey. I don't know, I don't know what you're thinking on it.
Well, I think this is just an extension. One, I think we're dealing with a huge sexuality crisis in our culture right now. I think as believers, we're aware who the prince and power of the air is, and that's Satan at this point. Not to over spiritualize it, but I think there just is a lot of spiritual darkness when it comes to all kinds of issues, and I think sexuality is a really, really big one that's impacting a lot of people right now. But the other thing that I think of is for years on college campuses, we were equating words with violence, right? There were safe spaces that were created. You can't say these certain words around these certain people because saying a certain term is equivalent to violently attacking a human being or violently hurting a group, a demographic in some way. And I think this is just a greater extension, an elevation of that issue, right? Which is um, my sexuality is the most important thing, the most fundamental thing to me. And for you to deny what I say I am, is you couldn't do something more egregious to me. So the fact that we're putting in these potential, as you said, litmus tests when it comes to religious belief, or litmus tests on, well, what if this child identifies as X, Y, and Z? Do you promise just to toe the party line and say whatever they want to say? Because we would rather this child lose out on potentially a really good home than be denied the identity that they claim they are. That to me is just topsy turvy, but it's not surprising that that's the world that we're living in.
Yeah, Val, I was going to ask you just, from a journalistic perspective, in terms of how these things are covered, you cover a lot of these stories and, approach them as a reporter, looking into the details and the facts. Are these stories, in your view, maybe even this particular one, given fair treatment in media in general? Because if the roles were reversed here and there were another group going through this sort of litmus test for fostering, you would imagine a lot of the mainstream outlets would be covering. Not that they're not covering this. I'm just curious of your thoughts on how these sorts of stories are kind of treated in the mainstream.
yeah, I would say that you definitely either don't see them covered, or you see them covered from sort of a more pro transgender slant, you could say. The argument on the other side would be that they're trying to increase their foster placements by opening things up to more LGBTQ foster parents, and that's why they have these rules. But it's actually, as it turns out, a large percentage of people out there fostering are Christians, and a lot of them see it as part of their ministry, and not just Washington State, but other places are in danger of losing these foster parents because of these rules that are being passed in blue states about affirming gender identity. Um, it's interesting too that the Alliance for Defending Freedom, they litigated a case like this in the state of Washington just a few years ago, and they won. The federal court decided that basically that this rule of theirs in Washington was discriminating against potential foster parents based on religion, and yet and so they kind of redid their rule a little bit, but not that much, and they they don't seem to have changed their mind, though. They're going to litigate this again, even though these cases seem like they're almost the same. So I don't have a lot of hope for the state of Washington winning this one, because they've already lost one, like I said, very similar a couple of years ago. But it just shows you how dedicated they are to this. This is like Trey said, this is huge for them. This is like an enormous issue. um, gender identity, and they're gonna go to the mat on this every time.
Well, it's a particularly interesting perspective because when the tables were turned and reversed, one of the big arguments for allowing same-sex couples to adopt, right, was that there's a lot of need, right? The foster system's overridden. And I'm just speaking more generally throughout the country. These are arguments that were made. And, you could make a legitimate argument that these kids need homes, right? And so people made that argument. It was successful. Now you have, now the tables have turned culturally. And now we're saying, wait, maybe these people who have the traditional views aren't able to foster or maybe even adopt these children. That's an interesting and bizarre flip, whereas the same argument I think would apply to both scenarios. Again, people will have different views on it, but are there merits to that, or am I crazy?
No, I think you're making a really good point. Yeah, you're definitely seeing that. If Washington's not the only place where we're seeing the foster care fight play out over gender identity and Christian and traditional religious views. It's playing out in states all over the nation, and the federal government under President Trump, they had gotten rid of the gender identity requirement. The Biden administration has come back in with it. It's something that's going to sort of go back and forth for a while now. But I will say that in court at least, the Christian parents who are trying to foster are winning.
So, okay, really quickly, I want you, and I don't want to truncate it too much, but this Virginia county that's made Easter Sunday Transgender Visibility Day, this whole debate that's going on around Easter, it's like, can we just have an Easter, people, without a drama? Can we just enjoy Easter? Here we are covering a number of these dramas, but can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it's definitely making waves right now.
Yeah, Fairfax County Board of Supervisors passed on March 19th a proclamation declaring March 31st to be Transgender Day of Visibility. Now, in the board's defense, let me tell you that Transgender Day of Visibility has been recognized on March 31st since 2009. It is a thing. It's been out there for quite a while, and pretty much every blue state and Democratic city will post a Transgender Day of Visibility proclamation on that day. Well, unfortunately for them, this year, March 31st is also Easter. And you're not seeing them posting pro-Easter proclamations. And so what you've got is a situation where it's like, okay, wait, you're going to, celebrate Trans Day of Visibility, but you're going to, ignore Easter. And in fact, the critics are saying you're not just ignoring Easter, you're mocking it by having Gender Day of Visibility proclamations on the same day. I was just in communication with Brian Birch of Catholic Vote, and he's like, just pick a different day. That's only been around for 15 years. Easter's been around for 2,000 years. So yeah, it's a real cultural clash that so happens just because of the way the calendar fell this year, but it really does highlight the discrepancy here in terms of the cultural views.
Yeah.
I want to say that maybe it's a good thing, right? I understand the criticism and the concern about it for sure, especially as a believer and knowing what Scripture says about sexuality. But I'm saying maybe it's a good thing because it's putting that clear line in the sand of, this is actually what the world's priorities are. The world's priorities are not Easter. They're not celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. It's celebrating this. So I think it makes it clear as Christians, not so we can look at people as our enemies and see, demonize people who don't think and believe what we think and believe, but it's a good way to start conversation. Say, look, this is where our culture is. We're not just being culturally Christian anymore. There are people who are actually believers, and then people who don't want to believe what the Word of God says. So I think it just makes having conversations easier because it more clearly draws the lines that we have in having these discussions, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And the last thing I'll say on this before we do a quick bit on my story is that we also, I think it's important to cover these things and talk about them on shows like this, but also like in society, we could just start to ignore some of this stuff. I think part of me wonders, if we ignored it a little bit more, because when everybody gets so outraged and you have the outrage police out and they're talking about it, now everybody knows about this Trans Visibility Day, right? And they didn't just read about it, they're seeing it in Facebook posts, they're seeing it everywhere. And it's like, well, you know what? Fewer people would know, and we could just not have a total freak out over it. And I'm not saying, and I don't want to diminish it, but I do think part of me has, even with some of the atheist stories that I've traditionally covered, I'm like, I'm going to cover the ones that really matter now. And I think, again, it's important to cover these things, but I don't think people should get outraged, I think is the point, in the general public over this stuff. So I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, but that's where I'm at. But I wanted to pivot into our last story before we go here. And So I wanted to transition into my story. And this one I'm just bringing up because I found it to be so bizarre. I mean, you guys have probably seen this. I know, Trey, you have. But Christy Shamblin, her daughter-in-law was Marine Sergeant Nicole G. She was one of the 13 service members who was killed in August of 2021 during the U.S. pullout of Afghanistan. Very chaotic time. But she was one of those 13 service members. And Christy has been out there talking and really trying to get answers, because the United States, the posture on the Afghan pullout from the government's perspective has been, this was very successful. And I think a lot of other people on both sides of the aisle have said, no, this was not successful. It was sort of a disaster, and we lost service members in a terror attack. And so one of the things that stuck out to me as really troubling is you have this Gold Star family, and there have been a number of families of the 13 who have spoken out. But Christy said that they have tried to get answers. They have reached out to the White House. They have reached out to the Biden administration, and they have gotten zero response or reply at all. Nobody has ever reached out to them. They had one interaction with the administration and the president 3 days after the terror attack, when they went to meet the bodies as they were returning to the United States at Dover. And in that interaction, lots of negative things said about, if you remember, there was the story about Biden reportedly checking his watch repeatedly and how offended the families were. But the part of this conversation, and we have it over at CBN News and Faithwire, that really struck me was this family really pleading for answers and not getting those answers. And I thought, gosh, I mean, that is just so troubling to me from a human perspective and a government perspective. Trey, you've seen this story. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think at the end of the day, the thing that matters most is relationships with other people. And especially when you're coming from the top, Joe Biden's not only the president, he's also the commander in chief of the military, right? And he is overseeing and running ultimately our military. At the end of the day, the buck stops with him. So I think regardless of what you think about his policies, what he's doing, how he's acting out as president and commander in chief, set all of that aside, the most important thing that he does is form those connections to especially to the people who gave their all for our country, right? So the people who lost loved ones, the Gold Star families who have lost their loved ones. I think it's most important that the president, whether you're Republican, Democrat, somewhere in between, I don't care who's in office, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, George Bush, your job is to build those connections to make sure that the country, and you're speaking on behalf of the country as commander in chief, is gracious and grateful for the service that they gave, and that needs to be recognized. I think if you lose that as a human being, like you were saying, that human to human connection, if you lose that, I think you've lost the conversation, because that human connection is the most important thing on this earth.
Yeah, Val, any thoughts on it? Just from a comms I mean, I like to look at things from okay, how should we be reacting to a story like this as a country even?
Yeah, I was just going to say, from sort of a comms and political perspective, I'm not surprised, because let's face it, the Afghanistan pullout is one of the three, if not the worst moment, one of the three worst moments, could be the worst moment of the Biden presidency. And they don't want any attention on that whatsoever, especially in an election year. So anything they give her, any email, any letter, even if it's just to say, we're very sorry for your loss, or something like that, they have to know that instantly becomes a story. She undoubtedly is in touch with reporters. She's probably shares that with them. Next thing you know, they've got Afghanistan on the news again, and then we're talking about it again. So I think what their strategy is, I'm just guessing here, but the smart political strategy, quite frankly, is to say nothing. Now that doesn't make it right, but that's probably, like I said, if you're trying to win an election, that's probably what you do.
No, you're spot on, and we'll leave it there. But you're absolutely spot on, because I think that's the goal, right? Not talk about it, and you have politics, and then you have humanity. And so I feel I wish our politics looked more like, and this is me editorializing, but it's just the truth, more like humanity and just being kind and giving her what she needs, which I think is some closure. And by the way, I just want to add this. The reason she's speaking out is she doesn't want any other family to face this. And I think that's something that both sides should be able to agree on, that we should have policies in place and procedures that ensure that our men and women in arms are protected. And so I want to thank you guys both for joining me. It was a lot of fun today.
Thank you, Billy.
That's all for today's show. Tune in next week when we go behind the headlines with some of the best reporters and TV hosts in the business. We'll see you again next week.